Welcome to the City of Glass. This is the history of Rose Hill Nurseries. I am the curator. My name is Andi Stix, and I have written this production. This was coordinated by Barbara Davis, who is the Nursery or city historian. The panel displays were by Susan May Gibb, and is sponsored by the Nursery Council and the Arts. And I want to thank all my friends and relatives for helping me produce this, editing it, listening to it ahead of time. Anyway, who am I? I'm your neighbor. My name is Andi Stix, as I said, and I came to the Council on the Arts because I'm an Intarsia wood artist, and I'm an educator of gifted youth. I run a program called GTEC. It's an after-school program. And I'm also a historical detective. I write simulations, debates, and discussions in history. So, one thing about me is that I love The Wizard of Oz. As a child, it was one of my favorite movies. It's a coming-of-age story about Dorothy. And she gets caught up in a tornado, she hits her head, and she ends up going on a fantasy journey, and she ends up picking up the Scarecrow, who needs a brain, Tin Man, who needs a heart, as well as the Lion, who is looking to have a voice and courage. This was written by L. Frank Baum back in 1900. And the reason why this was so important for me was because this is a young girl who's a coming of age, and she reminded me of me. I grew up with Fred and Sheldon Saul next door and my brother. We lived on close to 5 acres of property. I was one of the youngest, so I always wanted to have a voice, wanted to feel like I was smart and have courage, but I wanted to be well-liked. But what I realized as an adult, she was my first suffragist, okay? She was a young girl. Think about this. The movie is produced in 1939. She gets on a road and she's picking up men along the way. We don't think about that today, but back then that was unheard of. That was really something novel and new. What's also really interesting is that L. Frank Baum was the son-in-law of Matilda Gage. Now, Matilda Gage was one of the founders of the Women's Suffrage Association. And along with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So, I'm sharing this for a reason. I'm going to reintroduce this as we go along in the story at some point. How did the story come to be? Because I'm a historical detective. I don't have a horticultural background. I don't claim to be. But this is what happened. So I moved to Rose Hill Avenue and Siebrecht Place back in 1985. And you can see that this is a picture of the fall. My daughter's dressed up as a raisin, hugging Kaylee. Here are the fall foliage, and here is the spring season. But no matter when I'm planting, I find shards of glass all over the property. Okay? So a friend of mine, Ross, said, I haven't lived there in 10 years, he said, well, do you have any of the shards of glass? I called Yael Baker, who now lives in my home, because I moved 10 years ago. She said, it's still all over the property. So I went there, I brought a shovel. She says, you don't even need a shovel. Just go there, and you're going to find it. And that's what I found, a bag full of glass. So I went around the corner, and I said, I went to the local nursery, and I said, why am I finding glass all over the property? And they said, this used to be one of the biggest nurseries in the country. So I said, how big? He said, dozens of glass houses. I said, dozens? He said, yeah, dozens. Anyway, so I started to do some research, and this is Henry Siebrecht. He arrives in 1866 with $11 in his pocket, which today is around $275. And he is originally hired by the Buchanan Nursery. And very quickly, even though he was in his early 20s, because he had some schooling back in Germany, they realized this guy's really knows his stuff, and they put him in charge of one of the shops. Within a year and a half, he ends up opening up his first store, H.A. Siebrecht, and that was at 165 15th Street in 1867. He became really well known for lilies and orchids. The elite were very interested in him, and he now partners with Charles Wadley because he wants to expand his business in a few years. Over the decades, he ends up opening and closing different shops up and down or off of Fifth Avenue. And what was extraordinary to me was this picture, Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street. This is across from the New York Public Library. I said, get out of here, look at that. Anyway, so then I said, well, why the heck did he come to New Rochelle? And I researched some of the maps, and this was the first one. I think the name is Modian. That's the best I could decipher because I was using my detective glass, right? So here's my detective glass, and I'm looking at it. I'm trying to figure out the name. By 1867, it's Kimball, and then by 1878, we know that Siebrecht and Wadley bought it, and then it was transferred by 1889 just to Siebrecht. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a second. So, anyway, the father welcomes his son to the business. So now, what we know is that Henry Siebrecht has 5 boys and 1 girl. Well, through the years, the oldest son starts to join the nursery. And he decides that he really wants to put roots here in New Rochelle because it's not the city, and he wants his friends and his relatives and everybody to come and visit him because he's going to have so much more land to raise his family. Also, land's so much cheaper up here. Also, New Rochelle was known for having an agricultural community. They had blackberries, raspberries, as well as pears. And they had a German population here. So he had a lot of connections in different ways to bring him up to New Rochelle. Now, New Rochelle is gaining in popularity, and John H. Starrin opens up Glen Island Resort. Now, people in the summertime are now flocking up to New Rochelle. He's offering them free transportation. They bring in the railroad started to come up here. He had steamboat transportation. What did the resort have? It had beaches and pavilions and beer gardens and a zoo and an aviator and even a mini steam train for the young kids. So New Rochelle, through the decades, started to get a reputation as the Queen City of the Sound. It's not the Long Island Sound. It's sound because of the music that was going on here. It was a musical component. Anyway, I then found a deed in 1878. Now Charles Wadley and Henry Siebrecht are partners. They transfer the deed to their sons. Okay? So we realize that there's going to be longevity here. They're very serious. Now, I don't know if you know this, but any family that's got 5 boys, they're wrecking machines. This is the original house that we found, and he tears this down and he builds a gorgeous mansion. So when you enter Rose Hill Nurseries, you see the affluence, you see the elegance of the building, and this he built by the early 1890s. So we found a fabulous, Henry Camarella found a wonderful interview by Pauline Siebrecht. And it's like, who's Pauline? And I figured out through looking at genealogy and other references that it was Henry Siebrecht's niece who lived in Astoria. I said, okay, he came from Astoria, that makes sense. That's where he started out at the Buchanan Garden. So she had a wonderful interview where she describes that this is the entrance to Rose Hill Nurseries. Now, all the way on the left, it became Henry Siebrecht Jr.'s home, and that is a French second imperial architecture from the early 1870s. It became his, and there was also a stable. The Siebrechts owned 30 thoroughbred horses. one of which was Harry Clayton and the other one was Lady Brighton. To the right of the stables was a gazebo. That gazebo still stands there today at the entrance of Rose Hill Avenue. If you drive down and look 2 houses back on the left-hand side, you'll still see that gazebo. So, then I started to look at some of the graphic designs that I found on catalogs, and this was the one in the 1890s. We now see the beautiful mansion. We see the gazebo, Siebrecht and Son, and you drive in and you see all of this, and here is the shipping office, and behind here, oops, these are all trees. I don't know how to go back. Let's see if I can do that. Then by the late 1890s, I started to match this. Yes, this row is over here, that row is here, this row is there, but now we see coal towers. And we see this whole section of an addition in the back with a coal tower. So I wanted to know why do they have these coal towers? Then I found out about hothouses and greenhouses. Greenhouses are regular greenhouses like we know. Hothouses, on the other hand, are heated so that you can grow tropical plants all year round. Now, I did call Buchanan, and I called some nurseries to find out more about hothouses and greenhouses today. There's over 20 varieties. But since this is Andi Stix 101, we're sticking to hothouses and greenhouses. It's easier. Anyway, I found the original card by Lord and Burnham. They were the original glass manufacturers. And I also found a map in 1911 that showed that it has expanded. Here is Webster Avenue. Here is North Avenue, and here is Henry Siebrecht's estate. Here's one son, Henry Siebrecht Jr., and his other son, William, ended up moving to 87 Bon Air, and they put him in charge of the Madison Avenue shop off of Fifth Avenue. That expansion was also, I also found it in one of the pictures in 1897 that showed the palm, as in palm trees and palm plants, that they were growing at this point. And in 1970's Standard Star, F.J. Logan said, quoting Rose Hill, as it was the city of glass as far as the eye could see. So I started to trace these catalogs, and you could see the development even in the graphics of the catalogs. Here is Siebrecht and Wadley, the original owners, 1886. Then it became Siebrecht, still Siebrecht and Wadley, but here is Siebrecht and Son by the early 1890s. Now, we also see Rose Hill Nursery, but within a few decades, it evolves into Rose Hill Nurseries. So I said, wow. Not only that, in the later catalogs, they had furniture and decor. So now if you're the elite and you have an expansive, gorgeous backyard, they're now selling furniture along with the plants and the trees, expanding their empire. So, the former mayor, Jabez C. Knight of Providence, Rhode Island, asked for Henry to come up and to do landscape design. He was so happy with the area, he decides, well, land is even cheaper up there. He opens up his second nursery. Then, through the years, by 1894, he goes down, makes 3 trips to Trinidad in the West Indies, and now he buys a 3rd one. Now he's realizing, as we saw in the catalogs previously, instead of just plants, it's now becoming rare plants. And he is sending scouts all over the world to find these wonderful exotic plants. Well, I decide, because I'm a historical researcher and I work alone a lot because I'm doing research, I create this little imaginary trip in my head to make it fun for me. And I say, I'm going to meet Henry Siebrecht Sr. and have him take me on a tour. So I said, would you please give me a tour of the facility? And being somebody who's very involved with civics and his church, he's a great talker, and he says, of course, Andi, I'll take you along. So he brings me to many of the glass houses, and we begin with the roses and the orchids, and he shows them to me. This is in 1891, and I can see the Siebrecht and Son logo now has changed. And he talks about how he had showcased different plants that had never been seen before, the Grusentanlet and the Frau Karl Druschi, excuse me if I'm not pronouncing them correctly, and he starts to explain that he did this wonderful showcase at Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden we know as an arena for sports and shows. Historically, it was a garden. Well, he then explains the difference between the two different types of orchids, epiphytal and terrestrial. Terrestrials, like terrain, grows in the ground, right, the orchids, and the epiphytal, they can grow on top of rocks, on top of trees. So he shows me the different varieties, and then he shows me Belle Siebrecht rose. He actually named Rose for Belle Siebrecht. So I said, that's so cool. I know his daughter is Isabel. So anyway, he shows them to me, and I decided to do some research to find this Isabel rose, because I figured, wouldn't that be fun if I can showcase that to the audience today? And I found the Help Me Find, and I see that it's registered as a Mrs. W.J. Grant in 1899, and discovered by William Paul in the United Kingdom in 1899, showcased in Australia in 1900, and I'm like, wow, this is our gal, this is Nursery. So anyway, I decide to send them a note, and I send the library a photo image of the New York Times in 1895 that precedes all this. And I show them that Siebrecht's beautiful new pink hybrid tea rose, Belle Siebrecht, that has won many prizes. So I share it with them. Well, I was absolutely wrong. And that's the fun part about being a historical detective. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, you just want to know the truth. So they write back, and it was bred by A. Dickinson and Son in New Townards in Ireland. Then I find out that in 1892, the ownership rights and its propagation was sold to them for $4,000. Well, $4,000 today means $100,000. I mean, $4,000 then is $100,000 today. I was like, whoa. And they were awarded here, according to the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, with awards back then in 1893. And I was like, wow, didn't this cause like some issues back then? That he took a rose and he renamed it and blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, hold on, sorry, I put that down by accident. The answer is yeah. So I find in the Gardener's Chronicle, quote unquote, they determined to alter the name, that which we know as the Mrs. W.J. Grant Rose, is now sent out as the Belle Siebrecht. Now is a change of font, which I think, on this side of the herring pond, which is the Atlantic Ocean, ought to resist. And I would appeal to any of our nurserymen that they should be loyal to the British National Society, which awarded its gold medal to the rose under its English name. So, obviously, they were not that happy with the change of name. But it's all fun. It's all part of the story, so it's fun. I couldn't find any pictures of the Belle Siebrecht. The most recent one I found was back in 1928 by Kruger, and this is what she looks like. Beautiful. Anyway, Henry brings me the hydrangeas and lilies, and I said to him, did flowers have symbolic meaning back then? He said, absolutely. Well, this originally came from Asia, and he said in Asia, a hydrangea meant apology as well as appreciation. in early European history, it was a sign of arrogance and showiness. Now everybody uses them. And also he showed me the lilies. So he introduced the lilies of the valley, as I said before, but by this time he's able to grow the lily of the valley in the winter time due to the hot houses, and he is now selling those. And today it is the symbol of good luck and happiness for the nation of Finland. Anyway, so we looked at the fern and ornamentals and Boston ferns. They sold for 25 cents back then, and now it's $6. And then I said, my God, there had to be hundreds of people that were handling these 68 glass houses. It wasn't 10 or 20 glass houses. It's now grown to 68. And they even sold ornamentals and topiaries. So the Green Animal Topiary Farm in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, still has a topiary farm there, and it's great. If you ever go to Cape Cod, stop off, and it's wonderful. Henry also showed me the city it was like a city grid of trees. The same trees in rows, from Norway spruces and Pinus semba to pyramidal box trees. He even showcased 18 ginkgo biloba trees at the New York Botanical Garden. Now, they're very, very popular because they resist insects and they resist disease. So New York City loved to plant them, but then they learned very quickly they wanted to plant the male trees versus the female, because when this female give off seedlings, they smell like rotten eggs and people complain. So they had to learn how to pick up everything in the fall, but they are gorgeous, and this is a current picture of one of the ginkgo trees at the New York Botanical Garden. He was also known for aquatics, and he delivered many, many speeches and lectures for the Torrey Botanical Club on how to handle orchids. If it's too wet, they're going to get spots. If it's too dry, they're going to get insects on them. And he talked about, in the 1894 catalog, of using loam and manure in your soil. And I said, manure in your soil today for planting a few plants? The answer is yes. So I did some research. Chicken manure is #1, and cow manure is #2 today, sold in the United States. So he brings me to Henry Jr.'s 1050 home at the beginning, back to the entrance. And I look and I see the overview of this property, and it was just so astounding because now it's 40 to 90 acres, and I see that now we have the 2 coal towers plus a water station. But I'm saying to myself, this is like extraordinary. How do they manage all of this? And he explains and takes me on a tour of all the underground networking. This is where they fed coal to create the heat. And Mr. Pirro actually stopped in at Rose Hill Nurseries in the beginning of Henry's career, that is still there today, and he said, I used to shovel coal for them. And so this is what a coal tower looks like, and here are the ashes, and this is the coal, and it creates the heat. This was one of the original water towers, I think, wasn't quite sure, but then it was replaced because it was labeled Water Tower Pumping Station #2, Worthington Corners. And then I realized, I can't even imagine the amount of water that they're consuming, right? 68 glass houses, and so I found an article just a couple of days ago before this presentation, Worries of the Region Water Supply in 1891. Of course, people were saying there's problems here. They can't keep up with it. Well, wouldn't you know that the water company is literally butts up now with the replacement right at the edge of the property. Henry then brings me to the Office of Packaging, and it was mind-boggling. The logistics alone was incredible. As I looked and peered into this large facility, I couldn't get over, I counted over 20 men that were handling all the packages. Outside, I counted 1, 2, 3, 4 buggies that were being loaded for shipments. And there was even a delayed shipment. The men were supposed to do an installment in northern White Plains, and it took a lot longer. So the men ended up sleeping over there instead of packaging and repackaging, and they really wanted to make their deadlines. So it was extraordinary. And here, this building was moved and relocated to 138 Perth Avenue, but I'll talk about that more a little later. Then Henry tells me about how they started to transport things all over the United States, and obviously it was through the railroad. And they hired companies just to move. This is the American something something moving company. Look at this, just moving those large trees all over the United States. Well, by 1912, the New York, Westchester, Boston Railway cut through the western section of Siebrecht's property, and he was livid. And according to his niece, Pauline, she said they cut down those rhododendrons right and left. That's what was in her interview. Anyway, he was fit to be tied because so much of the plant life was over here all the way towards the reservoir that he ended up suing them. He sued them for $10,000 at one point, which is worth around $250,000 today, and the other time, and he won the other settlement as well, for $90,000, which is worth around $2,250,000 today. Well, not only did that happen, but once the railway came in, he had to create an underpass to get to this entire western part of the section of Rose Hill. So, and if you take a walk today across from Rose Hill Nurseries, there's a nature preserve there, and you can find evidence that this actually existed. And you'll see culverts and all sorts of things. So I said to him, you know, you're shipping material all around the United States? And he started to laugh. He says, yes. He says, not only did I get the title of Fifth Avenue from New York City because of all the beautification that he made, he also did Barnum's Hippodrome, St. Louis World's Fair, the New York Botanical Gardens, Coney Island Resort, Rockefeller's Kite Estate, and the Chicago World's Fair. Of course, he did John D. Rockefeller's wedding in 1901, and so you saw pictures on many of his catalogs. But this is the picture that I would like you to focus on now. This was the Columbian Exposition, Columbus, because the C-O-L-U, Exposition, Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And here's their horticulture building, and Siebrecht and Son did a lot of the greenery and foliage there, and this is what blew my mind. Just a month ago, I was visiting friends, and the Smithsonian magazine was on their coffee table, and I picked it up, and I went crazy. Now, why did I go crazy? Apparently, L. Frank Baum went to this fair and saw this, and this is what influenced him for the Emerald City. I went crazy. So I began to read, and it states, reporting from the Evening Post in Chicago, L. Frank Baum wrote about the light pouring through the walls of the windows of the white buildings, so bright that people purchased colored eye shades from vendors. See, white and all this incredible glass. This detail would later reappear in the wonderful Wizard of Oz, where all the residents of the Emerald City wear green eye shades. Now in the book, they wore eye shades. In the movie, the entire city was green, as we know. But he writes in the book, quote unquote, because if you did not wear spectacles, the brightness and glory of the Emerald City would blind you, Baum would write in the novel. This, as I said, Smithsonian Magazine, volume 55, December 2024. I was so excited, you cannot imagine. For me, the Wizard of Oz, my land had a historical contribution to the Wizard of Oz film. It was unbelievable. Anyway, what happened? Here is this incredible city. The whole thing falls apart? Why does it fall apart? What is going on here? Well, remember I told you that Henry Siebrecht had 5 boys and 1 girl. 4 of the boys pass away over a couple of decades, and then his wife Emma passes away. Wow, that was tough. So, how did you find out back then what was happening in your community? Because people didn't have telephones in their home at that time. And it was through the New Rochelle Pioneer. They had a column of what everybody was doing. Everybody. Whether or not you went to visit a friend, or you traveled to Asbury Park, or you bought a Baker electric car. Who thought there were electric cars back then? Or somebody got a new position at a company. Everything was gossiped about. That's where you found your information. Now, how many people today get divorced? Well, obviously, we sort of know it's close to half. Well, the answer is 46%. So, back then, what do you think the answer was? 1%. Well, unfortunately, Henry Siebrecht Jr. gets divorced in July 1911. And it's no longer making the personal file. It is now major headlines. And he was found kissing Mrs. Minor, but Francina Minor is then vindicated by 1913 in the courts, but everybody's talking all over town and they can't take it anymore. Now, Henry Jr. is busy doing a lot of fairs, right, across the United States and expositions, and he finally says, I can't take it. He moves out to California, and lo and behold, Francina Minor can't take it either, and they get married December 2nd in 1916. Now, Henry Jr. did a lot of good. He was one of the original founders of FTD, and which is the original florist telegraph delivery. He also established the House of Flowers out in Pasadena. And there is where he introduced the bird of paradise to the West Coast. So it was a very, very tumultuous and difficult time for the family. And I wanted to find out more about the House of Flowers, so I researched, and it still existed. I called them. Well, now they sell cannabis. No relationship to Siebrecht and Son. And then I made a follow-up phone call to find out that the entire shop had perished in the California fire, so it no longer exists at all. We continue. So Henry Siebrecht, none of his sons are there to help him with the business, and he decides that he's going to sell the land. World War I has brought about a lot of anti-German sentiment. There's now a boom in suburban housing. There are financial challenges. He's handling everything on his own, and he's up there in age. So he sells the property, and he moves to Perth Avenue. So if you're at North Avenue and you're looking westbound, this is the image that you would see from Henry Siebrecht Sr.'s home. If you're at my house, and my house was where the corner where Rose Hill and Siebrecht merged, I'm right here, was my property. This is looking up to North Avenue. Here's the mansion, here is the stable, and the gazebo, and Henry Jr.'s home. Well, this is a really cool story. In 1932, he decides he's going to purchase additional lots for his favorite employee by the name of Marzio Camardella. Marzio was Italian-born, came over here, worked for the Siebrechts for over 40 years, and he decides he's going to gift him property. And Marzio is now 68 years old, and the average lifespan back then was like 58, 61. And so Marzio says, do me a favor, Mr. Siebrecht, put the property in my son's name, Henry. Because Henry also worked at Rose Hill. And here are the lots, and here is the deed, and my favorite part is he sold it to him for $1, and this was his thank you. Well, Marzio was able to enjoy it for another 6 years, and then he had passed away. 2 years prior to that, in 1934, Henry Siebrecht dies. He's 86 years old, and he left such an incredible legacy, from being a horticulturist to a member of the church and chairman of banks. He was the first alderman of New Rochelle as well. He was the father of North Avenue, and they decided to gift him and rename a street after him. So Garden Place was now renamed Siebrecht Place. So I traced the different deeds going down through history, and as we know, Henry Camardella Sr. was the first deed. So when Henry dies, it goes into a trust, and here is Henry Camardella. This is the deed given to his wife, 1940. Here is Henry Jr., and this is his deed, which was passed on in 1962 to Margaret and Henry, a different Margaret. And now, Henry, wave your hand to everybody, and there's Henry. And here is the present-day nursery at 975 Webster Avenue. Henry is the great-grandson of Marzio. Would you believe it's passed through 5 generations? Anyway, that is my story. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.